You don't rush a good brisket. That's something my mother told me and her mother told her, and I've spent 63 years believing it. Low heat, time, patience. Let it do what it needs to do. The text came on a Thursday, October. The kind of October morning we get here in Nova Scotia, where the light comes in sideways through the kitchen window and turns everything amber. I had the slow cooker going, coffee in my hand, and my phone buzzed on the counter. It was from my daughter. Mom, we've been thinking. With the kids getting older and Tyler's parents visiting more, we think it makes more sense for us to use the cottage as our family base this season. You understand, right? I read it 3 times. I set my coffee down. I read it one more time. The cottage. The one I built. The one I spent 11 years paying off on a nurse's salary while raising 2 kids, mostly alone after their father and I separated. The one on the Brass Door Lake that I found in a real estate listing in 2009. A crumbling shell of a building with a rotting dock and a price low enough that I thought there had to be something wrong with it. There was. The foundation needed work. The roof needed work. Everything needed work. And I did the work. Not all of it with my own hands, but with my own money, my own decisions, my own weekends driving up from Dartmouth with a thermos and a list. That cottage was mine in a way that very few things in my life have ever been mine. And now my daughter was telling me by text that Tyler thought it made more sense for them to use it. Tyler. I want to be fair here. I have tried for 6 years to be fair about Tyler. He works hard. He loves my daughter, I believe that. He is good with the grandchildren in the way that some fathers are good, present when it's fun, elsewhere when it isn't. He grew up in a family where things were provided, where asking for something was the same as receiving it. I don't think he's a bad person. I think he has never in his life had to build something from nothing, and so he genuinely does not understand the difference between a thing that exists and a thing that was created. He sees the cottage. He does not see the 11 years. I didn't answer the text that Thursday. I poured my coffee out. It had gone cold, and I stood at the window and looked at the backyard, at the garden I'd put in along the fence, the raised beds my son helped me build 2 summers ago, and I thought about all the things in my life that had required me to be quiet and patient and to absorb something difficult without reacting. There had been a lot of those things. I had been quiet through a lot of them. I called my daughter that evening. She answered on the second ring, which told me she had been waiting. "I got your message," I said. "Mom." Her voice did that thing it does when she's already defending herself before I've said anything. "It's not a big deal. We're just thinking logistically. Tyler's parents are coming for 3 weeks in July, and we thought, 3 weeks, I said. They haven't seen the lake. They've been asking to come up, and we just thought it would be. I understand what you thought," I said. "I want to ask you something. When did I tell you that you could make decisions about the cottage?" A pause. "Mom, I'm not making decisions. You texted me to tell me you'd be using it this season. That's not a question. That's a decision." She got quiet in the way she used to get quiet when she was 12 and had been caught in something. Not remorseful, recalibrating. "We just thought," she said finally, "that with everything going on, it would be easier if you weren't making the drive up alone. You know how the highway gets in the summer? And honestly, Mom, you're always saying you're tired." "I say I'm tired of certain conversations," I said. "That's different. I want you to understand something about that exchange. My daughter is not a cruel person." She would be horrified to hear herself described that way. But she had absorbed, somewhere along the way, from Tyler, from the ease of their life together, from the slow, comfortable gravity of being the one with the growing family, the idea that my needs had become suggestions, that my boundaries were starting positions for a negotiation, that when I said something was mine, what I really meant was that it was mine until it became more convenient for it to be theirs. I had let that happen, not all at once, but in increments. The way water moves into a foundation, slowly, then everywhere, Let me tell you how the cottage became my cottage. In 2008, my husband and I agreed to separate. It was the right decision for both of us, and I won't dramatize it. We had grown into two people who were kind to each other and nothing else. The kids were teenagers. We divided things carefully and fairly. I kept the house in Dartmouth. He kept his pension contributions from before we married. We split what was in the joint account. By any reasonable standard, it was an amicable separation. What it left me with was a house, a moderate savings account, and the understanding that everything from that point forward was going to be built by me and no one else. I worked 31 years as a registered nurse, palliative care for the last 14. I want to say that clearly, not because I want credit for it, but because it shaped the way I understand things. When you sit with people at the end of their lives, when you hear what they talk about, what they wish they had done, what they're grateful for, what they regret, you come away with a very clear sense of what actually matters. People don't talk about the overtime they skipped. They don't talk about the safe choices. They talk about the lakes they swam in, the trips they took, the mornings when they did exactly what they wanted, and it was enough. I started looking for the cottage in 2009. I wanted somewhere that was mine, not the family home that held 14 years of marriage. Something new. Something that belonged only to the next part of my life. The listing for the property on the Bras door had been sitting for 8 months. I drove up on a Saturday in March, snow still on the ground, and the real estate agent looked at me like I was either very brave or very foolish. The building was rough. The dock was rotting at the end. The lot was overgrown. But the water. I stood at the edge of the property and looked out at the Bras door in March, and I thought, here. I bought it in April of 2009 for $87,000. I spent the next 3 years doing the necessary repairs in stages as I could afford them. I did not take a line of credit. I did not ask anyone for money. I drove up when I could, stayed in the rough version of it, made lists, called contractors, learned more about load-bearing walls and septic systems than I ever expected to know. When the dock finally got rebuilt in 2013, I stood on the new wood in my good boots, and I cried a little. I'm not embarrassed about that. My daughter and her brother came up when I had it in reasonable shape. They loved it immediately, the way you love something you didn't have to sacrifice for. They brought friends up. They brought partners up. When my daughter started seeing Tyler, he came up that first summer and said it was incredible and asked about the property taxes and whether I'd had the dock weight rated for a boat. I smiled and answered his questions. I should have paid closer attention to what they were. The next few years went the way those years go. My daughter and Tyler married. They had their first child, then their second. Tyler's career was doing well. They bought a house in Halifax that required renovations, which Tyler had opinions about, and my daughter relayed those opinions to me in a way that suggested I was meant to admire his vision. I admired it. I drove up to the cottage when I could, which was harder once I was working reduced hours leading up to my retirement. But I went when I could. It was still mine. That hadn't changed. What changed was gradual. The summer before I retired, my daughter asked if Tyler's parents could use the cottage for a long weekend in August while I was on shift. I said yes. Why not? They were family. They were welcome. The summer after, Tyler mentioned, not asked, mentioned that he'd had someone come look at the fire pit and get a quote for converting it to propane. It would be so much more practical, he said, especially with the kids getting older. I said I'd think about it. I didn't commission the work. 2 months later, I found out he had asked the same contractor to come back and give a more detailed estimate without telling me. When I brought it up with my daughter, she said, "He was just trying to help, Mom. He knows you're busy with the retirement transition." I let it go. That was my mistake. Not the only one, but a significant one. When someone tests a boundary and you let it go, they don't file it away as a one-time exception. They file it away as the new boundary. By the time I retired in the spring, the cottage had become, in practice, and the quiet assumptions of how summers were organized, something that Tyler considered a shared resource. He didn't say this directly. He said things like, "We were thinking of heading up the first weekend of July, and is there anything that needs doing before the season starts?" As though he were a co-owner making sure the property was ready for its owners. I noticed. I let it continue longer than I should have. I think part of me wanted to believe that it was affection, that claiming something is a form of loving it. I know better now. The text in October was not the beginning. It was the moment when the thing that had been happening quietly became something that had to be dealt with. After our phone call, I slept on it. I slept on it for several nights. I talked to no one except my friend, a woman I've known for 30 years who has a gift for saying exactly the right number of words and no more. I told her what the text said. I told her about the phone call. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are you asking me what to do, or do you already know?" I already knew. I called my daughter back 5 days after our first conversation. I'd written down what I wanted to say, not a script, just the points I needed to cover so I wouldn't get pulled off them by emotion. "I want to have a clear conversation about the cottage," I said. "No texts. I want to be direct with you." She said, "Okay." Her voice was careful. "The cottage is mine," I said. "I bought it. I paid for it over 11 years. I made every decision about it. That is not a shared history. That is my history, and it belongs to me." "Mom, I know that. I'm not finished." What happened over the past few summers is that Tyler began treating it as though he had some authority over it. The contractor, the conversations about what needed changing, and I made the mistake of not addressing that sooner. That's on me. But your text last week told me that this had moved somewhere I'm not willing to go. A long silence. "Tyler's parents are welcome to find a cottage rental in Cape Breton," I said. "There are beautiful properties up there, and it's a reasonable drive from Halifax. I'll be happy to suggest some areas." "Mom," her voice had shifted. "I'm being clear," I said, which I should have been much earlier. What followed was not a good conversation. She said I was being hurtful. She said Tyler had only ever tried to help and I was making him into a villain. She said the kids loved the cottage and she didn't understand why I was making it into a legal situation. I said I hadn't mentioned anything legal. I said I was simply telling her what was mine and how I expected it to be treated. She hung up. My son called me 2 days later. Someone had talked to him, and I knew who. He was gentler about it than his sister, which is his nature. He said he thought there might have been a misunderstanding. He said Tyler had a lot of good intentions. I said I believe that. I said good intentions don't transfer ownership. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "So what happens now?" I told him I hadn't decided yet. That was true when I said it. But somewhere over the following week, while I was driving up to the cottage alone for the last weekend of October, watching the Cape Breton hills go the color of rust and amber, something settled in me. I had been going back and forth about what the right response was, whether to be more assertive about the terms, whether to have a lawyer send something formal, whether to offer a conversation with Tyler directly. And then I was standing on the dock in the October cold, the lake flat and gray and beautiful, and I thought about what I had built here and why I had built it. And I thought about sitting with people at the end of their lives and what they talked about. They never said, "I'm glad I held on to the thing that had become a source of pain." They said, "I wish I had let go sooner and found something better." I went back inside. I made tea. I sat at the table where I have sat 100 times and looked out at the bra's door, and I thought I could spend the next several years defending this, fighting for the right to be welcome in my own space, watching Tyler make suggestions that are really decisions, watching my daughter relay them to me in that careful voice. Or I could do something else. I called a real estate agent I trusted on the Monday after I came home. I told her I was thinking of selling the cottage. She asked me if I was sure. I said I was getting there. She sent me a market analysis within the week. The Cape Breton market had moved considerably since 2009. The number she gave me was more than 3 times what I had paid. I asked her to list it quietly. Word of mouth first. She had a serious buyer within 3 weeks. I did not tell my daughter until the conditional offer was firm. I remember the moment I made that call. I was in my kitchen, the slow cooker going again. Different season, different recipe. And I dialed her number and she answered and I said, I want to let you know I've accepted an offer on the cottage. The sale should close in about 6 weeks. The silence on her end was a particular kind of silence. I've sat with enough people in difficult moments to know the difference between the silence of grief and the silence of shock. This was shock. You? What? She said. I've sold it, I said. I wanted to tell you directly. Mom. Her voice broke a little. Mom, you should have told us you were even considering. I considered it privately, I said. The same way I bought it privately. It was my decision to make. She cried. I let her cry. I didn't argue and I didn't apologize. I had nothing to apologize for. Tyler called me 2 days later. This was the first time he had ever called me directly about anything significant, and I noted that. He was composed. He said he thought we should have had a conversation before I made a decision that affected the whole family. He used the phrase the whole family twice. I said it didn't affect the whole family. It affected me. It was my property. He said he felt that I was being reactive, that the text from my daughter had been misinterpreted. I said, I didn't misinterpret it. I read it carefully, several times. He said he hoped I wouldn't let this become something that damaged relationships. I said I hoped the same thing, and that I thought the path to that was everyone being clear about what belonged to whom. He did not call again. The sale closed on a Thursday in December, 3 days before my granddaughter's birthday party, which I attended. I brought her the book set she had asked for and a new pair of winter boots in the right size because I had quietly checked the tag in her old pair the last time I was at their house. My daughter and I were careful with each other. Polite. The kids were loud and happy and covered in icing, and I sat at their kitchen table and watched them and thought, this is what matters. Not the thing, the people. Tyler was pleasant, appropriate. He thanked me for the drive-in. I thanked him for hosting. With the sale proceeds, after taxes, and yes, I spoke to an accountant and a financial planner because I am 63 years old and I did not get here by being careless. I did several things. I maximized my TFSA for the year. I set aside a portion for each grandchild in a registered education savings plan, which I set up myself in my name, with the beneficiaries clearly designated. I updated my will. I had a conversation with my lawyer about making sure everything was structured correctly, which is a conversation I should have had years ago and did not. And then because I'd spent 31 years doing for others and I had sold the place where I used to go to breathe, I booked myself a trip to Portugal. A friend of mine from my palliative care, years now retired herself, had been talking about Lisbon for the better part of a decade. We had always said someday. We had never booked it. I called her in January and I said, I'm going to Lisbon in April. I want you to come. She laughed. She said, give me 24 hours. She called back in 18 and said she was in. We spent 11 days there. We walked until our feet hurt, and then we sat in small restaurants and had wine and talked the way you can only talk with someone who has known you long enough to ask the real questions. We went to Sintra on a morning when the fog was still in the hills, and I stood on the edge of something old and beautiful, and I thought about the Brasdor in October, and I thought, it isn't gone. It's changed shape. I came home with a tan and a small ceramic bowl I bought from a woman at a market in Alfama who made them herself. I keep it on the kitchen windowsill. My daughter and I are better now. Not back to where we were, and maybe that's fine. Maybe where we were included some things that needed changing. We have dinner once a month. We talk about the grandchildren, about her work, about mine. We don't talk about the cottage. I don't think we need to. She asked me once, carefully, a few months after the sale, if I regretted it. I thought about the dock in October, the gray flat lake, the question my friend asked me. Do you already know? I said, not for a single day. She nodded. She looked at her coffee cup. I think she understood something that day that she hadn't fully understood before. I think she saw me, not as her mother in the background of her life, reliable and available and infinitely adjustable, but as a woman who had built something and had known when to walk away from it and had not waited for anyone's permission. I'm sitting in my kitchen now writing this down because I want to remember it clearly. The slow cooker is on. The light is coming in the way it does in the late afternoon, turning the room gold. I have my tea. I have my ceramic bowl from Lisbon on the windowsill. I have my TFSA in good shape and my grandchildren's education started and a passport with a new stamp in it. I have the thing I went looking for in 2009 when I stood on a piece of frozen, overgrown property and thought, here, myself. Clearly, and without apology, that was always the point. I think about the dock a lot, not with sadness, not anymore, but the way you think about a place that taught you something true about yourself. I stood there in October, the brass door going gray and quiet, and I understood something I had been circling for years, that I had spent a long time making myself smaller so that other people could feel more comfortable in the space I had created. That is not a coincidence. That is a pattern. And patterns, if you don't interrupt them, become the shape of your life. What happened with my daughter and Tyler did not begin with a text message. It began much earlier, in all the small moments when I said nothing. When I let the contractor conversation pass, when I smiled and absorbed and adjusted. I am not saying this to blame myself. I did what a lot of women my age were taught to do, which is to keep the peace, to smooth things over, to believe that accommodation is the same as love. It isn't. Accommodation without limits is just a slow way of disappearing. I spent 31 years in palliative care. I watch people do the accounting at the end of their lives, and I can tell you honestly that the ones who carried the most regret were not the ones who had made bold choices. They were the ones who had waited, who had deferred, who had told themselves that the right moment to speak up was just a little further down the road. And then one day, the road ended. I did not want that to be my accounting. What I had to find, and it took me longer than I would have liked, was the clarity to know my own worth without needing anyone else to confirm it. That is harder than it sounds. It requires a kind of honesty with yourself that is uncomfortable. You have to look at the moments when you stayed quiet and ask why. Not to punish yourself, but to understand the mechanism, because once you understand it, you can interrupt it. Tyler is not a villain. I meant that when I said it. He is someone who grew up in a world where things were available to him, and he moves through my world with that same assumption. But I had let him. My daughter had relayed his suggestions in a voice that expected compliance, and I had complied, and in doing so, I had taught them both something false about who I was and what I would accept. When I finally spoke clearly, when I said the cottage is mine and held that line without softening it, I was not being harsh. I was being honest for the first time in several years. And honesty, even when it costs something, is always the more decent choice. It is the thing that makes a relationship real rather than merely comfortable. I sold the cottage. I updated my will. I sat across from a financial planner and made decisions about my own future with full attention and no apology. And then I went to Lisbon. None of that was reckless. All of it required a kind of steadiness, the willingness to do the hard thing clearly, to think carefully about what was right rather than what was easy, and to keep going when the people I loved were unhappy with me. I am 63 years old. I raised 2 children and worked 31 years and built something beautiful from a rotting shell on a lake in Cape Breton. I have earned the right to my own life. So have you. Whatever it is you've been waiting for permission to do, I think you already know what it is. And I think you already know that the permission has to come from you.